My wife had gone to live with her mom to take care of her, so I decided to surprise her with our son, but when I got there, the front door was wide open, and what we heard inside completely changed everything between us forever. That moment, standing frozen in the doorway, everything I thought I knew about my life shattered. Because what I saw inside wasn't just a lie, it was a cruel, calculated deception that had stolen months from me, and something far more precious. My 7-year-old son, Ethan, stood beside me, finger pressed to his lips, eyes wide with a silent, uneasy warning. When I leaned in, I saw my wife, Sarah, laughing in the living room with her mother, Joyce, wine glasses in hand. They both looked incredibly healthy, vibrant, even a stark contrast to the devastating reality I believed they were living. Sarah said she needed to move in with Joyce for round-the-clock care. Her mom, she told me, had stage 4 pancreatic cancer, the kind where you count days, not years. I supported her completely. How could I not? When your family faces something so devastating, you just do. I took on every household responsibility, Ethan's school, his homework, his bedtime. I covered all bills for both places. Over 7 weeks, I even sent Sarah $8,000 for medical expenses. I trusted her entirely. The way you trust someone you've built a life with, the mother of your child. I never questioned her honesty. Why would anyone lie about cancer? About 3 weeks in, I started seeing odd signs. Small things that didn't quite add up, but I pushed them away, feeling guilty for even noticing. Sarah was posting almost daily on social media about her caregiving journey. Updates like, day 21 of caring for mom. Some days are harder than others, but we keep fighting, with photos of her by hospital equipment or holding Joyce's hand. Hundreds of likes, comments, prayers, heart emojis, offers of food. I'd scroll through these posts late at night, after putting Ethan to bed, feeling this strange disconnect. Online, she was a hero. During our brief phone calls, which got less and less frequent, she'd sound exhausted, saying Joyce had a rough day, treatments were taking a toll. But her voice didn't sound exhausted. When I asked specific questions about doctors or treatment plans, she'd get vague, change the subject. Then there were the photos themselves. I'm no tech genius, but I know phones embed metadata, date, location. Some photos she claimed were from the hospital were actually taken at restaurants or shopping centers. I convinced myself maybe she was just reposting old photos, or the metadata was wrong. But the real crack in my denial started with her nails. I know, it sounds stupid, but hear me out. About a month into her supposed caregiving, I video called her one evening. She had this elaborate manicure, long acrylics with intricate designs, probably $80 minimum. When I mentioned they looked nice, she got defensive. Claimed they were old, from before she moved in, that she hadn't had time to get them removed. I let it go. But 2 weeks later, I drove by Joyce's house to drop off groceries. I saw Sarah getting out of a car, and her nails were different. A completely new design, fresh, obviously recent. When I brought it up later, she insisted I was mistaken, that I was remembering wrong. The way she said it made me feel paranoid, controlling, for even noticing. The food delivery charges bothered me too. I had access to our joint credit card statements. She was ordering almost daily, $147, $160, $120. Excessive for someone caring for a dying woman who probably couldn't eat much. When I asked, she said the food was for both of them and sometimes visiting family. It sounded plausible enough, so I dropped it. But it just added to this growing pile of small inconsistencies I couldn't ignore anymore. My surprise visit wasn't planned as some test. I genuinely wanted to do something nice, knowing how hard caregiving can be. So, after school on a Friday, I packed Ethan and drove the 40 minutes to Joyce's house. My idea was to take Sarah out to dinner, or at least give her a break. The front door was slightly ajar, not wide open, but cracked enough to hear voices. Ethan peeked through the gap, then froze, turning to me with a look I'd never seen before, whispering to look but stay quiet. I bent down. That's when I saw them. Sarah and Joyce, on the couch. Both dressed in expensive-looking athleisure, like they'd just returned from the gym. Both holding wine glasses. A very nice bottle of red on the coffee table. Laughing at something on a laptop screen. Joyce looked nothing like someone in the final stages of pancreatic cancer. She had color, sat up straight, moved fluidly, energetically. Sarah looked relaxed, happy, a way she hadn't looked when she actually lived at home with me. I stood there, watching for maybe 30 seconds, my brain trying to process what I was seeing, trying to reconcile this scene with everything I'd been told. Then I heard Joyce ask if they should post the hospital photo now or save it for tomorrow. Sarah laughed. She said they needed to space them out so people wouldn't get suspicious. Then they scrolled through photos on the laptop, commenting on which ones looked more authentic, which angles made Joyce look sicker. I pulled Ethan back from the door, walked us quickly to the car. My hands shook so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. On the drive home, I felt like I was having an out-of-body experience. Nothing was real anymore. That night, after putting Ethan to bed, I sat in our dark living room. I forced myself to think through everything systematically, to look at all those small, weird signs I'd been ignoring and see them for what they actually were. The picture that emerged was so much worse than I'd wanted to believe. I grabbed my laptop, went through Sarah's social media posts carefully, screenshotting everything, checking metadata on every photo. The more I looked, the more obvious it became. She'd been staging the whole thing. The next morning, I called a private investigator, one of those services you find online that feels sleazy just to search for. When I explained the situation to the guy on the phone, there was a long pause. He told me he'd seen cases like this before. They never ended well for the person doing the lying. If I'm wrong, I'll live with that, I whispered to myself that night, staring at the investigator's contact info. But if I'm right, everything is about to burn. 3 days later, the investigator called. His tone told me everything before he even started explaining. He'd followed Sarah for 72 hours straight, documenting every movement, every location, every interaction. What he'd found was far worse than I'd imagined. No hospital visits, no doctor appointments, no chemotherapy, nothing suggesting a dying cancer patient. Instead, he'd watched Sarah attend yoga classes at an upscale studio, have 2-hour lunches with friends at expensive restaurants with multiple bottles of wine, and go shopping at high-end stores, spending money like someone on vacation, not caring for a terminally ill parent. Joyce had been with her for most of these outings, looking perfectly healthy, energetic, laughing and chatting with an ease nobody in stage 4 pancreatic cancer could possibly manage. The investigator had photos and videos of everything, time-stamped and geotagged. An irrefutable timeline that contradicted every single thing Sarah had told me. He even had video of them at a wine bar on an afternoon when Sarah had texted me saying Joyce was having a particularly rough day and couldn't have visitors. In the video, they were toasting with champagne. But then he told me something that made my stomach drop in a way that even the fake cancer revelation hadn't. Something that transformed this from personal betrayal into an actual crime. He'd found a fundraising page Sarah created about 3 weeks into her supposed caregiving journey. Titled, Help Joyce Fight Stage 4 Cancer, with a long, emotional description about her mother's diagnosis, the devastating financial burden of treatment, and how any support would mean the world to their family. The page had photos of Joyce looking frail and weak, obviously staged with props and lighting to make her look genuinely sick. It had raised $22,680 from over 300 donors. I sat there staring at my phone as he sent me the link, reading comment after comment from friends, coworkers, distant relatives, and complete strangers moved enough by the story to donate money they probably couldn't afford to spare. The investigator's voice went hard. This wasn't just about a lying spouse anymore. This was felony fraud, federal wire fraud specifically. I needed to understand the seriousness of what Sarah had done. He spoke slowly, making sure I understood this kind of crime came with prison time, not just fines or probation. I thanked him, ended the call, and immediately started going through that fundraising page, a sick feeling growing in my chest. I recognized so many names. People from Sarah's office, $100 here, $50 there. Neighbors who gave what they could. Even some of my own family members, who'd contributed without telling me, wanting to help during what they thought was a devastating time. Sarah's best friend donated $500, saying Joyce was like a second mother. Ethan's teacher gave $75. A couple from our church donated $200 with a note about keeping Joyce in their prayers. There were donations from people I'd never heard of, strangers moved by the story. Every single one manipulated and stolen from. I called a lawyer that same afternoon, one specializing in both divorce and fraud. When I walked into her office and laid out everything the investigator had found, she actually leaned back in her chair and let out a low whistle. She said this was one of the clearest charity fraud cases she'd seen in 15 years. The lawyer explained that what Sarah had done wasn't just morally wrong, it was multiple felonies, wire fraud and theft by deception, at minimum, possibly more. She asked if I wanted to pursue criminal charges or just handle it through the divorce. I told her I needed time to think. Pressing charges meant Ethan's mother could end up in federal prison. But then she pointed out something I hadn't fully considered: all those people who donated deserved to know they'd been scammed. They deserved to get their money back. Staying silent would make me complicit. She advised me to gather every piece of evidence, document everything meticulously, and be prepared for this to get very ugly, very fast, once the truth came out. I left her office with a strategy that felt both necessary and terrifying, a plan to expose everything simultaneously so Sarah couldn't control the narrative or destroy evidence. The lawyer also suggested I file for divorce immediately, starting that process in parallel, since these things could take months. That evening, I started building the case systematically. I went through months of credit card statements, matching charges to Sarah's social media posts, finding dozens of instances where she claimed to be at the hospital on days our card showed purchases at restaurants 30 minutes away. I compiled all the investigators' photos and videos into a single folder, organized by date and location, creating an undeniable timeline of deception. I screenshotted every post Sarah made about her caregiving, every comment, every update about Joyce's supposed deteriorating condition. I downloaded the entire fundraising page, including the full list of donors and their comments, preserving everything before she had a chance to delete it. Then I did something that felt like crossing a line, but I knew it was necessary. I called Joyce's oncologist, the doctor Sarah had mentioned several times in her posts as treating the cancer. The receptionist initially refused any information due to privacy laws. But when I explained I was trying to verify a cancer diagnosis for legal purposes and could obtain a subpoena, she transferred me to the office manager. The manager was willing to confirm if Joyce was a current patient. She put me on hold for several minutes. When she came back, her voice was carefully neutral. She confirmed Joyce had been a patient, but had been discharged over a year ago after treatment for a growth that turned out to be non-cancerous. According to their records, Joyce had no current cancer diagnosis, was completely healthy, with no follow-up appointments scheduled. I asked if she'd provide that information in writing with a subpoena, and she said the office would comply. That phone call was the final nail in the coffin of any lingering doubt. Absolute proof that this entire situation was a calculated fraud, not a misunderstanding. Sarah hadn't just stretched the truth about a real medical situation. She and Joyce had invented a terminal illness from scratch and used it to manipulate everyone for money, sympathy, and apparently, just time away from real responsibilities. I spent the next 2 days preparing emails to everyone who needed to know. Careful messages, just enough evidence to be credible, without overwhelming people. One email to the police department with the investigators' full report and a detailed timeline of the fraud. One to the fundraising platform's fraud department, with documentation of the fake cancer claim and proof from the medical office. One to the 3 local news stations, because I knew this kind of story, feel-good donation campaigns that turn out to be scams, was exactly what they covered. And one final email to all 300-plus donors, blind carbon copied so nobody's email was exposed, explaining what I'd discovered, apologizing profusely for Sarah's actions, and assuring them I'd cooperate fully to get their money returned. I sat there, staring at my computer screen, all 4 emails queued up, ready to send. My finger hovered over the mouse. I knew once I clicked send, there would be no going back. I thought about Ethan, how this would affect him if I was destroying his mother's life. But then I thought about all those people who'd been stolen from, people who'd given money out of genuine compassion and deserved justice. And then I thought about what kind of person I'd be if I let Sarah get away with this. What kind of example that would set for my son about accountability and consequences. I moved my cursor over that send button. If I'm wrong, I whispered to the empty room, I'll live with that. But if I'm right, everything is about to burn. I clicked send on all 4 emails simultaneously. Watched them disappear from my outbox. A strange mix of relief and absolute terror washed over me. There was no taking any of it back now. Within 20 minutes, my phone started buzzing with responses from donors, shock, anger, gratitude that I told them the truth. I turned off my notifications, I couldn't read them all in real time. The police department responded within an hour, opening an investigation, needing a formal statement. The fundraising platform froze the account immediately, sending an automated message saying they'd begin their fraud review and work on returning funds. 2 of the 3 news stations called that evening, asking for an on-camera interview. I agreed. I wanted everyone to know exactly what Sarah had done. No possibility of her spinning this, no playing the victim. The next morning, I packed Ethan and drove back to Joyce's house, the same house where this nightmare had started. I wanted to confront Sarah face to face before she heard from anyone else, to see her reaction when her entire scheme collapsed. The front door was unlocked. I heard them inside, having what sounded like a casual planning meeting. Sarah's voice, saying they needed to post another hospital update soon to keep donations coming, maybe add details about experimental treatments to justify asking for more money. I pushed the door open, walked straight into the living room. They were both on the couch, laptop open, surrounded by shopping bags from their latest spree. Their faces, when they saw me, went from surprise to confusion to pure fear in about 3 seconds. Sarah started to say something, probably some excuse, asking why I hadn't called. But I cut her off. I asked her a simple question, how long were you planning to keep this going? She tried to play dumb, an innocent expression that might have worked on me 7 weeks ago. But I pulled up my phone and started reading from the investigator's report, listing specific dates, locations, activities. I watched her face go from confused to pale, then absolutely white, as she realized I knew everything. Joyce actually tried to defend it at first, claiming they needed the money for other medical expenses, that the fundraising was just to get help they legitimately needed for various health issues. But I told her I'd spoken to her oncologist. I knew there was no cancer at all. Never any stage 4 diagnosis. That's when they both went completely silent. Sarah finally asked me what I'd done, her voice shaking. I told her the truth, without emotion. I'd sent everything to the police, to the fundraising platform, to the news stations, and to every single person who donated to her fake fundraiser. The color drained from her face entirely. She stood up, like she was going to run. But I told her there was nowhere to go, that the police were probably already on their way, and that she needed to understand the magnitude of what she'd done. She started crying then, saying she'd made a mistake, asking if we could just return the money quietly and make this all go away, promising she'd never do anything like this again if I'd just help her fix it. I almost laughed at the absurdity of thinking she could commit federal wire fraud involving hundreds of victims and just apologize her way out of it with a quiet refund. Joyce started yelling at me, calling me vindictive and cruel for destroying their lives over what she called a harmless scheme that hadn't really hurt anyone. I pointed out that $22,000 stolen from hundreds of people who trusted them wasn't harmless. It was a serious felony, and they were both about to face the consequences. The police arrived about 15 minutes later. 2 officers, clearly briefed, walked in knowing exactly why they were there. They separated Sarah and Joyce, taking statements individually. I watched through the doorway as Sarah tried to explain herself, making herself sound like the victim, claiming she'd been under so much stress, hadn't been thinking clearly, never meant for things to go this far. The officers weren't impressed. After about an hour of questioning, they told both women they'd be hearing from detectives soon about formal charges. This investigation would move quickly given the clear evidence. I took Ethan and left before the officers did. I didn't want him to see any more. On the drive home, he asked in a small voice why Mommy had been crying. I told him as gently as I could that Mommy had made some very bad choices and was going to have to face consequences. Sometimes grown-ups do things that hurt other people, even when they're supposed to know better. But that didn't mean he'd done anything wrong, or that any of this was his fault. The local news ran the story that evening at 6 o'clock, leading with a headline about a local woman scamming hundreds of donors with a fake cancer diagnosis. They included Sarah's photo, screenshots of the fundraising page, and some of her social media posts. My phone exploded with messages from people I hadn't heard from in years, some supportive, some accusatory, asking how I couldn't have known what Sarah was doing, or if I'd been in on it. The investigation moved quickly. Detectives interviewed dozens of donors, subpoenaed records from the fundraising platform and from the stores and restaurants where Sarah had spent money. Within 3 weeks, they'd built a case including wire fraud, theft by deception, and charity fraud charges for both Sarah and Joyce. The prosecutor told me it was one of the clearest fraud cases she'd handled because the evidence was so overwhelming, the victims so numerous and sympathetic. Sarah was fired from her job the day the news story broke. From what I heard through mutual friends, she became completely socially isolated as people who trusted her realized they'd been manipulated and wanted nothing to do with her. The trial took 4 months to get to court. I attended every day with my lawyer, watching as the prosecution laid out the timeline of the fraud in excruciating detail. They showed the jury photos of Sarah at expensive restaurants on days she'd posted about sleepless nights in the hospital. Credit card statements showed thousands in luxury purchases funded by donated money. Testimony from Joyce's oncologist confirmed no cancer diagnosis whatsoever. Statements from donors who'd given money they couldn't afford based on a completely fabricated story. Sarah's lawyer tried to argue this was just exaggeration that got out of hand, that she never intended to hurt anyone, just went through a difficult time and made poor decisions. The jury didn't buy it for a second. They found both Sarah and Joyce guilty on all counts after deliberating for less than 3 hours. The judge sentenced Sarah to 12 years in federal prison and Joyce to 8 years, saying their calculated deception and exploitation of people's compassion warranted significant punishment. I sat in that courtroom, listening to their sentences. And I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no vindication. Just this hollow exhaustion. And relief. It was finally over. My divorce was finalized about 6 months after the criminal trial ended, the process dragging on because Sarah's legal situation complicated everything. Eventually, the judge granted me full custody of Ethan and divided what little assets we had left after legal fees and restitution payments. I started taking Ethan to therapy immediately to help him process everything. His therapist helped him understand his mother's choices weren't his fault, and it was okay to feel confused, angry, or sad. He once asked me, during a quiet moment, if I still loved his mom. I told him the truth, as carefully as I could. I loved who I thought she was, but not who she really turned out to be. And sometimes people aren't who we think they are. And that's not our failure. Sarah tried to call me from prison a few months into her sentence. Probably wanting to apologize, or ask for something, or maybe just hear a familiar voice. But I let it go to voicemail, then blocked the number without listening to the message. I had nothing left to say to her. For the first time in years, sitting in my living room with Ethan asleep upstairs in his own bed, no more lies to uncover, no more evidence to gather, I felt something I hadn't felt since this whole nightmare started. I felt peace. Knowing all this, what would you have done if you were me?